Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome, and thanks for your attendance here tonight for our workshop, our gathering, whatever we want to call it, and welcome to the staff members too that are present with us, and Nigel Graves, Dr. Nigel Graves, will be playing a big role in tonight's agenda. But first, I'll open the meeting by the acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the Ngadjuri and the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present today. The attendance, well, we've got Councillor Michael, who regrettably has just run out of gas on his phone and he's out of action tonight. Do we have any other apologies? I don't think we do. No, we're all here, all good. And there he is. Oh, there's Dean. Yeah, he's there. We have no leave of absence and we have no non-attendance at this stage. Tonight we've got a deputation and a presentation regarding our 23-24 budget and long-term financial plan and planning, and a report for a decision later from the Rosalie Township expansion and the Higginbotham request. But the most important topic tonight, of course, is our budget and long-term financial planning topic. And I might introduce Dr. Nigel Graves to perhaps kick the ball into touch.
Thank you, Mayor Bill. I will try to get through this as quickly as possible. I'll just say at the outset that there's a scheme behind the sequence of what I'm going to talk about. There's a fair bit that I'm going to talk about. There's a scheme. It's quite possible that you might have questions along the way that might get answered towards the end. So it would probably be helpful if we have the questions towards the end in case they have already covered it. You'll find a couple of sheets, a couple of larger sheets in front of you. They're two of the slides. It's going to have a lot of numbers on the screen, so I thought you might appreciate at least having a bit of a hard copy that you might scribble on where it gets a little bit complicated, what I have to say.
And we can actually see the numbers.
Exactly. So in terms of what I wanted to talk about tonight, I am going to talk about the key dates, although we've got some suggested changes to those key dates. So Jean might briefly talk about that. I'm going to talk about the budget preparation status. It's fair to say we've had a few challenges with systems, etc. this year. And now I don't have a presentation. Oh, yes, we do. I just want to briefly talk about the line of sight between financial plans and what's for finance accounting people are trying to achieve. A reminder about the key budget assumptions. And there was a particular one in there about what we were going to do with the draft budget and rates. And I'd like you to really carefully consider the implications of what we originally decided, because what's happened since then is going to dramatically change that. I'll briefly talk about the Northern York Landscape Board levy, which you will receive a full report on it at some stage, but I'll just highlight the implications of what's happening there. I'm going to talk about the overall capital budget, the borrowing and the CAD, the cash advance debenture review. And probably the highlights of the night will be some information about what's happening with the property values that we've now received. And I'd like to talk to you about some various rating options compared to what we originally thought we would do in the draft budget. I'll throw up the business concept cases for the next 4 years, a table of that. Opportunity for some other questions. June, do you want to talk about this now rather than me saying things that are now going to change?
Yes, can do, through the chair. Yeah, we've had to just push out our meeting for the Audit and Risk Committee meeting that was scheduled for the 17th of April. So we're now scheduling it for the 1st of May. And then subsequently, we need to have a special council meeting on the 2nd of May. This will push out the public consultation by a week, but we will still remain on target to hopefully consider the full budget at the June council meeting. So we maintain our end date, but we've just had to juggle a little bit around implementing our new finance system. So it's proved a little problematic, but we'll get there.
Thanks, Jean. Budget preparation status, yes, as Jean implied, we've had a few challenges with especially the data translation part of data coming out of the old system into the new. Creation of a new chart of accounts, a new scheme for how we record numbers, that's caused us a few challenges and caused our managers a few challenges in putting their budgets together. So that's required us to do quite a few manual corrections as we're going along, which has delayed us. One of our bigger impediments was we had some issues with the new property rating system, and a very important part for the budget because we're having difficulty getting the rates modelling working. So that tells us how much council rates we're going to generate. And once we put in some options, that was finally resolved last week, and it seems that what our Valuer General is doing in the way they provide the data caused a bit of complexity for a system developer that are used to other Valuer Generals providing it in a different way. So but we're all on board now, so things seem to be working well. We've received the main property valuation from the Valuer General, and what I'm going to talk about tonight is that main one. It does not include any growth property, so it gives us a good opportunity to compare exactly with what we did for the current financial year, so you can see what the effect of any increases are going to be. I just wanted to talk a little bit about long-term financial modelling, and as I said, there's a bit of a scheme in the way I'm talking. It's because I'm going to talk about something I'm going to try a little bit different with you that's been done at Light previously. So I'm building up to that. That's why I'm talking about some of the real practicalities and challenges that you face in long-term financial planning as you see it. I understand you've all had a bit of a awareness training, but from a practitioner point of view, from a consultant point of view, there's a few challenges with what you have to do by law. And one of the things you often see is what I call indexing rather than target setting. I'm pretty sure, especially after listening to the last meeting, you're more interested in target setting, what you want to achieve, not me going getting a spreadsheet and adding CPI to everything. That's not long-term financial planning. That's just presenting something to meet legislative requirements. One of the shortfalls that I've just skipped over is that sometimes organisations just show a deficit in their operating statement. And this is one thing to look out for, that you don't allow me to do it. If you budget for a deficit, chances are you're actually budgeting for a loss. Chances are you're budgeting for a short-term borrowing. Yet these plans don't actually reflect that. It's only implied. So you have to find those sorts of money along the way. But the biggest challenge that you all face is bringing the three main statements together. Those statements talk about operating, they talk about a balance sheet, and they talk about cash flow. And especially to do with capital expenditure and funding, you can find little bits and pieces of the scheme in different parts of those statements. And Other than the fact I've been using these things for many, many years, I'm used to it. I would imagine it's quite difficult for people, especially those coming from a non-local government finance background, understand what's actually going on. So I'm trying to simplify it, and that's part of the reason why you've got those sheets in front of you. And as I said there, local government has some particular peculiarities. We have a massive interest in assets and infrastructure creation, and it's quite different to what you find in a lot of other parts of the financial management world. This is a bit hard to see, but this I just stole from somebody else's. I'm not going to say anything nasty about light regional councils, but some of the sorts of things you see in other statements, and this is just someone else's balance sheet. Trade and other payables. Oh, for the next 10 years, it's going to be exactly the same number. Provisions, non-current, to do with staffing, probably pretty much going to be exactly the same for the next 10 years. No point us preparing that sort of statement. We need to be setting targets to improve how we're doing, not necessarily just adding up numbers. And then obviously they had a bit of difficulty deciding, well, will we actually borrow any money in the future? Well, yes, history doesn't show exactly what's going to happen, but chances are I would bet that this organisation is actually going to borrow money in the future, but they don't know what. So you really need to bring this sort of information together to come up with a better understanding of where we're headed to. This is a bit of a refresher, I suppose, in terms of line of sight. What I mean by line of sight is that what I want to leave you with after this particular planning part of the process is a long-term financial plan that you can then compare with your annual business plan. You can compare easily with your annual budget. And when you do budget reviews, you can run your eye across every number and see exactly where it's tracking. And then when we're doing the reporting, you can do exactly the same with your during the year financial reports, your annual financial statements, and any performance measures we have to do. I think it's probably fair to say that there's bits and pieces the way we've done them in the past, and I was party to that last year, that doesn't actually enable you to achieve that, because things have been presented in different ways, especially in terms of those monthly financials. A bit of background. Why do we do it in this particular way? It's because Local Government Act says we do it in this particular way. So Local Government Act says I have to present to you all of these reports in accordance with a model chart of accounts. So the chart of accounts sets out how things should look. So you achieve that line of sight through all the documents. And supposedly it was developed on the basis of setting everything at a strategic level that is where the council should operate at. Those model chart of accounts are approved by the minister every year. I tinker with them a little bit, probably not a lot this year, but that's where that process comes from. And what I'm talking about, and this isn't any particular purpose, but I went back and did the statement of comprehensive income and compared the last 6 years with the current budget process. What I'm saying from line of sight is you should be able to go and have a look at these numbers and know confidently that you can compare right across there and know that there is an outcome that is consistently measured. The other reason I threw this particular slide up was the bit I highlighted, just as a precursor to what I'm going to talk about before. An income statement, pretty much in line with what you probably see in most private sector, except when you get down to here. And this is what I mean by the local government peculiarities. You've got all this stuff down the bottom, which is very, very different than the peculiarities of local government. So we're getting assets given to us. Not a lot of that going on in the private sector. So we get massive infrastructure assets. Some people argue they're liabilities, but we have to record them somewhere. So someone goes and shoves them at the bottom of your profit and loss statement. Yeah, I don't know why, but we do it. But just to keep in mind, Depreciation, 6-ish, probably building to 7-ish million a year. That is an expense on your equivalent of the profit and loss statement. It's not cash. So if we balance up this budget, that means you're bringing in something around about 6.5, 7 million through your rating to replace the assets. That's the key point I wanted to make and get to. Key budget assumptions. The whole idea behind the assumptions is supposed to be we give you some advice on what we think they should be so that we can go away and prepare a draft budget with some confidence that we can come back and present to you. I think in the many budgets I've prepared, that's probably generally been the way it worked. But the last few years, we seem to have got sidetracked from it. And last year especially, we came along and said, well, let's prepare the rates on this particular basis and then arrive the values, the property values, and nothing like what our expectations were. Maybe we should have better crystal balls, but nothing like it. So we went back to the drawing board on rates. So there's no point, when I'm saying no point telling you, look, this is easy, we're going to get all this money, but we find out it's all driven by big changes in values. The word is, I'm going to show you in a minute, we've had big changes in values again this year, and they're all over the place. So it makes it very difficult to prepare a draft budget. So I'm looking for your guidance in regard to that. We're looking for an operating surplus between 0 and 5%. Why 0 and 5%? Well, at least 0. There is some science behind that, but I'm not sure I can explain it to myself. 2% salary wage increases because we've got enterprise agreements pretty much locked in for this financial year, and then making assumptions about what's going to happen elsewhere. We said at the outset 3% for non-salary operating expenditure, except for some key items, because we knew very well that energy fuels going to be far more than 3%, and it's a key part of what we do. So we're going to have to budget what the actual increases on that are. So why 3%? Because everybody knows that inflation is something far more ridiculous than that. Well, not necessarily to us. First of all, with the salary wage increases, that's nearly a third of the budget, so that's already constrained. So we're talking about the rest of the operating budget, and we're not talking about depreciation. So it's not a huge amount of what we do, because a huge amount of what we do is actually in the capital side of the organisation, which is in the construction costs. 3% is target setting. Target setting so that we set the budgets on the 3% maximum for the non-salary, other than the key items. And if there are cost increases above and beyond that in individual items, well, then we're going to have to wear it in terms of improving how we do things. So it's an efficiency measure, common one that's done in government. We set 3% for fees and charges. So why only 3%? I know we've got to be careful with the Reserve Bank forecast, but the Reserve Bank's saying by the end of 24-25, we're going to be back around that 3%, maybe 3.5 to 4 towards the end of this financial year. So you're not just a cost increase receiver, you also set costs. So I'm saying that in a difficult economic times, this would be a responsible approach to it, that we're trying to achieve efficiencies as well as keep reasonable increases. Supposedly, inflation has already capped. The joy about the regional landscape levy. Yes, it is it's not a direct budget impost in the sense that whatever the landscape levy is, we're going to add that to the rate notice. So it's just going to go straight out. So the board's advised us that they've kept their total income budget to an 8.4% increase. which seems to be not in keeping with their cost structure. So they haven't said anything about the cost structure, but so it's just the CPI inflation. This year they're applying what they call their equalisation process. So previously I gather that all the different councils in the board area got different rates, and there's probably history that some of you probably know more about why that's the case. It's probably where those boards came from or originally formed. And it's fair to say that there's some that are going to get an increase and some that are going to get a reduction. So there's a common rate. The annual business plan of the board has been approved by the relevant minister. There's a hint there. And for White Regional Council, the fees are going from 354 to 552. So a little bit more than 8.4%, 56%. So when you're thinking about White's council and service charge, council rates and service charge, you might also just think about that that's also going to be appearing on their rate notice, and it's pretty much outside your control. Although, as I said, you'll probably be seeing a report on this subject later. There's other councils, so the ones with the large increases, similar to us, Adelaide Plains, Barossa and Gawler, and those with very large reductions, Copper Coast and Port Pirie. Look forward to that. So, as I said before, bring the long-term financial plan together. I think I've explained a fair part of why. Depreciation is a funding source to renew assets. Some of the managers here are probably sick of me saying it, but I try to convince them that fully funded depreciation is your friend. You balance your operating budget, the cash is coming in the door, and you're going to have enough money to replace the assets that you own. I consider that to be a positive thing. So when we build something and we get the depreciation for it, that's replacing it in the future. So we've always got it. It's items like capital grants and contributions. For example, contributions for the Bunyip 2, which will come from the developers. Selling of assets, whether it be trading in plant or actually selling off some land, has cash flow implications and income statement implications. Additions to infrastructure. We build something that has balance sheet cash flow implications, as does work in progress. Loans can be quite difficult to track from the way long-term financial plans are presented to you, because you've got to find the interest and you've got to find the principal, and then you find the cash repayment. And CADs are extraordinarily complex to track because they have both, we're paying them off and we're drawing them down during the year multiple times. So it can be quite difficult to see how that comes about. And good old reserve accounts. Fortunately, we've only got one for the CWMS, but the accounting for that is also very, very complicated, as are the funding flows. Talked about it in the committee meeting about how that was working, but very difficult to see in your long-term financial plans. An approach that I've successfully used in the past is this, and it's one of the big sheets that you've got in front of you. You wanted to scribble on it. Any people who've been around as long as I have would remember accounting when we used to have a statement of applications and sources of funds. And a few decades ago, the accounting profession decided we're going to throw that out and we're going to bring in a cash flow statement. Well, unfortunately, when they threw the statement of applications and sources of funds out, they actually threw out quite good information. And it's especially good information in the world that Jason works in. So Jason comes along and says, I'm going to build this for $1 million. And he gets pretty well through the project. By the 30th of June, he spent $900,000. And he's still got another 100,000. So that 100,000 is going to be spent next month or so, and the project's finished off. Where's the 900,000 at the 30th of June? From his perspective, he's built $900,000 worth of an asset. long-term financial planning, you're going to find it in work in progress. Excellent, because we actually haven't finished the assets, so it hasn't been capitalised. So it keeps people like me occupied. So, but very, very difficult for you to actually see the tracing of it. So the coloured part at the top, as the heading, underline heading says, I'm just going to call it outlays. This is what you're going to spend money on. And in terms of that particular example, we're not going to complicate it. We're going to say it's $1 million and it's going to be in the new capital. And we won't worry too much about ins and outs of accounting with work in progress. Outlays will include when we repay cash advance debentures. So you can see in the 22-23 year, there's that 22 million that we got for Bunyip 1, and we're going to repay the CADs. So you go down to the funded by, you've got the Bunyip Water Scheme, that's the 22 million that came in the door, give or take, a bit of rounding. The big difference with the way, and this is not complying with good old accounting, but the big difference with the way the outlays and how they're funded is that we're including what I call internally generated funds. So there's that depreciation. So the top box is what we're spending the money on, including paying off loans. The bottom box is what brings all the money in to help fund all of that. Now, I'm only talking about capital expenditure. I wouldn't like to do this for operating. It'd be just too complicated. The intent of what we're trying to do is both the total funds and the total outlays, they will balance. They'll balance because we use the cash advance debentures to either draw down if we've got a shortfall or repay. So what we end up with is a net change in our cash advance debentures, which is a great tool for this sort of thing. So you'll see, as it stands today, and we've done some adjustments with where we think Bunyip 2's heading compared to what we're doing with the budget. So this is probably more up to date than the current year's budget. You can see that we're talking about a net, we're paying out 14.2 million in CADs by the end of this year. So that's the net result of drawing down cash advance debentures for whatever capital purpose with other capital purposes we have, or repaying the cash. The rest of this line, so the next year, we're currently thinking something like about a 5 million drawdown from the cash advance debenture, and most of that is Bunyip 2. So that's net of 4 million grant that we'll be receiving during the year. So all this will be in detail in later budget sessions. Yet you'll notice after that it's pretty much break even for the next 5 years. So we've washed out the big bunyips and we're back to even keel. We get out to 29-30, and this is one of the beauties of this scheme, and we're going to be short $10 million. That doesn't look very good, and this is when we start talking about, well, we're going to be mindful of our intergenerational obligations, because if we said, oh, look, in that year, we're going to have to pay off $10 million worth of cash advance debentures. If you wanted to raise your rates by 10 million that year, you'd have a lot of screaming and yelling going on, I suspect. The beauty of this sort of scheme is that we can plan for that. Why is it occurring? Simply because all of the cash advance debentures have matured by that date. So they've all got different maturity dates on them. So that's something we certainly want to consider during the budget process, during the cash advance debenture review process, but also over time. It's not one of those things you want to leave to the last minute. Which is a good entrance into this slide. So there's a council resolution. We should review the CADs during the budget process. Why? Because the local government finance authority is saying you people aren't using your cash advance debentures because they were approved for different purposes, and it's a constraint on us because if anyone who doesn't use their debentures, preventing other people from borrowing within their limitations. CADs are great for certain projects, fantastic for what happened with Bunyip 1. Borrow along the way, get the money in, pay them off. Bunyip 2 will be exactly the same, potentially. Borrow over the next few years. If it gets paid out, pay off the CAD. Not that good necessarily for intergenerational assets. So if you go and build a $2 million infrastructure asset that's going to have a 30, 40-year life, if you do it with a CAD, fairly short-term borrowing sort of approach, it means the ratepayers of today are paying pretty much for somebody else using an asset well beyond the time they will be. So we've got to be a bit careful with that approach. So I'm suggesting we should probably now, because of that 10 million challenge out there in 29, we should develop a medium long-term borrowing strategy that maybe have a mix of different approaches, not necessarily just the CAD. Just a reminder, this has been the history. So it looks like our LGFA borrowing probably peaked around 21, 22. It will increase again as Bunyip Water advances and the construction that accelerates, etc. And that's the other sheet, which you can all take home and study, because this is not a decision, certainly not a decision for now. But what I just wanted to explain to you was the top half of this sheet are our approved cash advance debentures. So that's what we've got now. On the left-hand side, you'll have a debenture number and there'll be a maturity date. So the ones we're focused on are the ones that are going to mature in a relative near future. And the bottom half is what we do in finance, in treasury management. So when we need to actually borrow, and it might be on a day-to-day basis, especially between receipt of council rates, we might have to borrow 500,000 today. First thing we go and do is say, well, which CAD had the lowest interest rate? Because a couple of these were specials during COVID. So let's borrow for them first to keep the interest rate going. Then we tend to use the next oldest, because after that, the interest rates are the same. What I wanted to highlight to you here is especially what I've highlighted in yellow. So what we've done is we've taken our net drawdown, and these are not the rounded numbers that you would have seen on the previous sheet, and we've applied them to the relevant cash advance debenture and done a borrowing on a desktop exercise. Now keep in mind that these are 30th of June estimates each year. Our cash flow does this 4 times during the year, and the 4 rates instalments happen. So we get 4.5 million comes in, got lots of money. Halfway through for the next one, we're possibly drawing down on a cash advance debenture, and back we go again. So there is a cash flow management need behind some of our cash advance debenture borrowings. The thing to particularly notice is that CAD 49, as at 30th of June, we're not using through all of those years on our current estimates. So that's probably a bit of a target for, do we actually keep it or surrender it? I suppose I should have the good news was that there's the 11.3 up the top for Bunyip 1, and that got surrendered. So that took a great chunk out of our borrowing. As I said, during the year there is cash needs, so it's possible. I doubt it, but it's possible that part of that 5,945.945 million might get used, depending on what else happens, especially what Jason's doing in the capital program, because that's where the biggest chunks of our money head out the door pretty quickly. Also notice though that CAD 51, the 5.175 million, again as at the 30th of June, is not used. So they're probably candidates for considering surrendering. There possibly are other options, and that is you've got, if you have a look at CAD 53, CAD 53 is 4.5 million for a strategic land project that was approved last financial year or last year, and that did have some sale of land related to it. Hasn't occurred as yet. It's the application for that is still sitting on the Local Government Finance Authority's desk to approve when we need the money. They will approve it at a minute's notice. We've just got to say so, but it's quite possible that we could say, well, let's not proceed with that. We'll just use one of the existing CADs. So maybe keep that in mind for that future discussion. The future discussion said we'd resolve it by the date that the rates are declared, late in June, so we know exactly what's happening with our monies before we make that decision. I think I've already said all this. Skip. Okay, I think this is probably the highlight. So the main valuations received. I'm going to give you a summary of trends in terms of the overall valuation. I'm going to talk about the valuation change by land use in total. I'm just going to focus on primary production and on residential. That's where the most properties are. And people are always saying, oh, 10.82%, that's the average. So average 10.82 for primary production and average 12.97%. So no real growth. That's just current properties as we left them for the current budget. So this is what we are looking at in terms of trend in our last publications. So you can see that in 21-22 rate setting process, I think primary production caused us a bit of grief, and in 22-23 that dropped away a bit, and residential came back to cause us a bit of grief. So that's what it was last year, and this is what it looks like now. So residential's just gone gangbusters. So that's what you're going to have to deal with in terms of rate setting process. And I didn't expect that blue line to be looking like that when we did the budget assumptions a few months ago. So this is just a summary table. I've just highlighted the big ones. So you've also got vacant land. There's a fair amount of that. That's also gone up significantly. So just to share within, so two slides on each, so they're actually sort of readable. Primary production to start with, assuming the primary production is not in Kapunda, but in the Kapunda area, there's probably the big winners in terms of 18% increase. That's quite different to last year. Hamilton, nearly 15%. Freeling in that area, nearly 14%. And interesting, you know, you had Europe away, well, more like 8.5%, and Seppeltsfield around the 6%. So it's all over the place. So when you think about the average, if you said, well, let's do this particular strategy, you might have some people that are actually going to be paying quite a bit less, and the others paying considerably more. Very few people are going to be happy, I would have thought, with that outcome. Residential Roseworthy is the big winner this year. Existing properties, no new properties in that. 18% increase. So someone's driving up the market. Wasley's nearly 18% as well. Newry 17%. So Newry residential, very different to the primary production increases. Freeling 15%. Freeling went sort of gangbusters last year. And then gone gangbusters again. So there's a multiplier going there. Kapunda was right up the top last time, but still a 10% increase, but settled relatively. And again, Hewitt was also way up there last time, but that to me surprisingly settled. Certainly selling homes in Hewitt. So that's what you've got to face with. This was just a reminder of what's happened over the last few years in terms of total rate revenue. So effectively this year was a slight real decline in real terms. And this is what I was hoping I'd get some feedback from tonight in terms of some possible rating options. So one option would be just to keep the policy as the draft budget, not necessarily your final rates, but do the draft budget in terms of the existing differential rates. I don't think you have to be a mathematician to work out that multiplying those percentage increases by the current differential rates are going to get a massive increase in revenue and obviously a massive increase in the amount of rates payable by people. Option 2 would be to reduce the differential rates, to lower the rates payable. But again, where do you do that? Because you can do it for the average, but you're still going to have people with some significant increases. And option 3, similar to what we did last year, reduce differential rates and consider a rebate again for high value increases. So where do you do that? This was just going to be a reminder of approved policy and legislation. One of the things I wanted to sort of highlight differentiation under the policy we should review annually, and they were the things that we should take into consideration. Very difficult to do, of course, but they're things we should take in consideration. But the Act says rates are a tax. But it also says that you need to provide reasonable relief for people from the impact of rates. It's all very well for somebody to give you those rules. It's pretty tough, but also need to take into effect the impact on future generations. So what does that mean? Well, yes, you could reduce renewal of assets. You're just passing on that problem to somebody in the future. So that's the sort of thing that will mean. Other things in terms of the policy, we're saying that from an equitable point of view, around about 10% on the minimum seems to be a reasonable conclusion. There's lots of reasons behind that. That we don't do a rate cap in the legislation. I know rebate effectively does the same thing, but a rate cap is something different. And the reason we don't do a rate cap is because the rate cap can only be applied to owner-occupied residential property. So you can't apply it to anybody else. So it's an administrative problem for a start, because you have to know who's owner-occupying and who's investing. And it just becomes a nightmare, but it's unfair and inequitable anyway. So what the policy says is that you will, based on last year's experience, consider the impact of rapid property valuation increases by a rebate for 1 year. Sustainability also gets talked about in that rating policy. And effectively what it means is ratepayers don't like volatility. They don't want a big increase this year and a reduction next year. But people need to plan for what happens. Just a bit of information. This is regarding that last criteria on the previous page. What should you consider? So it was suggested that one of the things we should look at would be, for your information, the value of assets between township and rural. But we also looked at the depreciation of all of these assets. And the thing to be particularly mindful of is that depreciation is very, very closely aligned, for those who were at the committee meeting, very closely aligned to the asset management plan. So the asset management plan has been indexed since these numbers. We were talking about 4.4 million in renewal expenditure. So depreciation in the current year is about 4.1. So it's pretty close alignment. So what this would mean is that around about 56% of the renewal would be heading towards rural infrastructure, and about 44% would be for township related. The assets between township and the rural infrastructure quite different. You can see that in the rural infrastructure that the vast majority of the depreciation relates to roads, unsurprisingly, but spread over a whole range of different curbing, stormwater, etc. assets within the townships. But when you look at it in this particular way, you probably, if you see the value being, well, there's probably more value in the township, 52% in terms of asset value. Well, why does it go the other way in terms of the rural infrastructure? Simple answer is that township would be much longer life assets. So you probably got stormwater or something lasting 40 years in the township, whereas unsealed roads, etc., in the rural part. So you're expecting to have greater amounts of renewal expenditure every year because of those shorter useful lives. So in terms of the options, option one, so let's leave the differentials as they are, and you're going to be increasing general revenue by 19%. I assume your answer to that is no. That you'd like me to present another option, that would not be acceptable to our ratepayers. So option two, as I said, we could reduce the differentials. This is approximate because the values keep coming in every week with new properties, etc., right up until the week that you actually declare the rates. We could reduce the residential rate, and keep in mind the residential rate is your prime rate, and all the other rates are a ratio percentage of the residential. We could make it an even 0.4 of a cent. I put 3 stars next to that for a reason. I'll come back to that, but we'd be talking around about, in this option, a 3.4% average increase in people's rates. And remember that average again, some will be paying potentially a lot more and some will be paying less. Primary production, 3.12 would get you a similar rate increase, about 3.3%. I'm just saying, well, maybe that's sort of fair. And vacant land would work out to about 3.6% because that is a much bigger increase in values. So the reason why I put the 3 stars was that just for you to consider that if you went below the 0.4, you might be able to squeak it down a little bit closer to 3%, but you might create a perception that, you know, we're now a 3 point something rating residential area rather than the 4. It might be difficult for you to increase it again in a future year. Won't make a lot of difference. It's just a perception thing. So that's not the one I'm selling. I'm hoping to sell you this one. So we reduce the differentials exactly as per option 2. We put a valuation increase limit of 10%. And we provide a rebate just like we did this financial year. This year, we made 11%. There are probably valuation increase and reasons why 10% is better. Plus, it's a simple number, so everybody understands it. You get limited to 2% increase regardless of your value. So I would have thought if you're on a 15, 16% increase in your property valuation, that's probably not too bad a deal. What that would do would bring the actual rate increase down to more like a 3% average, which obviously is much less than inflation, quite easily able to sell that. I'm getting towards the end. So basically this is what it would look like. We'd be talking about a 925 million, which would be a 2.8% increase. Just like the round number of 925. That's probably why it's only different to 3. We'd be talking about the 3% roughly in terms of the refuse collection. $600 CWMS to be consistent with that. And again, you're not setting the rates, you're just giving me something to then go and draw you up your draft budget based on that. So this will generate, I suppose, a challenging scenario, because I imagine we're going to have to work fairly hard to get our expenditure in line with that 3%, because we're going to have some big energy increases. I might not dwell on this too much, considering what I've spoken about a lot, but when you get the presentation, you can have a bit of a look at this summary. It's probably too hard to see on the screen, but this is the business cases and the summary of the capital. There's a couple of new ones in here. There's one for the strategic plan, and there's a review of character preservation. Probably when you've got a chance, if you could have a close look at, there's extra columns for updates in terms of some of these programs. So some things aren't happening exactly as they were originally programmed, so they're probably going to be spread over a couple of years. And with that, my voice is done. It's now your turn. I hope you're going to say, I agree with you, Nigel.
Thank you so much for that, Nigel. That was an excellent presentation. Probably gave us a few nightmares tonight, but we did enjoy your presentation. I'll open up for questions. Councillor Dean.
Nigel, I've got one based, it's around the rate rebate cap, which was introduced last year. And there's some confusion about whether it's limited to a 10% valuation increase and the rates calculated on that, or whether the actual rate increase was 10%. And I actually did the calculation on my rates last year. I think my valuation went up 15%. The rate cap was 11%, but my rates went up, I think, about 8%. So what basically that means is that the rate was calculated on limiting the valuation increase to a 10% increase. And so if you reduce the rate in the dollar, which we are proposing here, that means your actual rate increase will be less than 10%. Is that what's going to happen this year, or was that an error that happened last year?
That's what would happen this year.
Yeah,
exactly the same.
So you're looking at them probably a much less than 10% increase maximum.
Well, depends on your valuation.
Yeah, that's assuming, yeah. But I'm saying if you limit the increase to 10% and you work out and you reduce the rate in the dollar, it's easy to work out what the actual percentage increase in your actual rates is going to be once you know the current rate in the dollar and the new rate in the dollar. So that's, I was expecting initially 11% increase in my rate last year, but I was quite pleased to point out it wasn't that.
And I'd say that the way we did it complies with the principle of simplicity.
Yeah, that's right.
It'd be very complicated for us to do it in terms of the actual rates payable.
Thank you, Nigel. Any further questions, councillors?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, again, back to the rate cap. Do the ratepayers have to apply for that rate cap, or is that automatically put on their rate notice? And if someone had that rate cap put in last year, is their 10% increase going to be from last year's rate at the reduced rate, or at the actual rate it should have been last year to what it is this year, if that makes sense? Shivers.
The second question actually helps me with the answer to the first question from Dean, and that is that it will be this year's increase only. So we're not combining whatever happened last year. So the policy as it stands is 1 year only, 1 year rebate. So for some people, there will be a bit of a catch up already because they got a rebate previously, and now they're going to end up with that come through. Sorry, what was the first question? My brain is getting tired. You should have answered that first.
I've forgotten too.
It was about if you had the rate increase, the rate rebate last year, would it carry over to the following year?
Yeah, well, that was it.
The application process.
Yeah, the application process, that was what it was.
That is entirely up to the council. I did skip over that dot point because the dot point said, assuming same rules as were applied last year. So last year we said by application, we would make it as simple as possible for people to apply. So what happened with the rate notice was the rate notice said, and it all explained in there. Of course, you had to read all that stuff, but it says in there you're eligible for a rebate, and you can go online, you insert your valuation number, etc., and then you click the button, and it sends an email directly to our people in finance and rates, and they work out the eligibility. The other rules though were that, and this is probably the biggest one, was that ineligible if you bought the property this year, because obviously you didn't experience last year's value, you bought the property. You might have actually caused the value. And if you had a significant development, and we said notionally 40,000, I think the councillor suggested that as a reasonable amount last year. I don't recall what the actual justification was. So that if you've done a significant addition to your property, you've caused the increase in the value, so you're not going to get a rebate.
Councillor Lynn?
Sorry. Yeah, I just want to know how, if a farmer sold 250 acres around Freeling about 3 weeks ago for $9,500 an acre, how does that affect that farmer? Does it come into play straight away, the valuations? Does it increase the valuations around alongside the paddocks alongside, and so if that farmer has now sold $1 million worth of land, I mean, it's ridiculous, 250 acres for $9,500 an acre, but how does that affect the valuation of surrounding farms? It's probably a dumb question.
It's certainly not a dumb question. I should have brought my wife in. She's the property valuer. It's complicated because there's all sorts of exemptions in terms of the way these things are done. I would say initially, though, I'd be most surprised if the Valuer General was able to actually value that this year. So the chances are it's going to come into play next year. If you have just finished building your new house at Roseworthy, I reckon that's a different story, because I haven't actually seen the Roseworthy new housing come through the value yet. My guess is that that's a big thing, and they're actually going to do a site visit later on, and then we'll get them all. I'd be most surprised if they'd be doing a site visit on that. Primary production's also complicated because if it's still used for primary production purposes, it's still going to get a notional primary production value.
Mm.
So the market value is driven by what? If it's driven by, oh, this is the greatest farm we've ever had and it's going to give you a great return. Yeah, well, maybe the value might say, yeah, time to push the price up. But if it's being driven by a market that says, oh, that land might be used for something else in the future, that won't get captured into the primary production value.
Just further to that, the runner-up on the $9,500 an acre also bought some land north of Kapunda at 9,000 after that, and that same farmer's now bought 2 lots. So it's interesting to see that the valuations have gone up so much, and who drives that 9,000 an acre? The neighbours, you're right. No, it's complicated. All right.
Thanks, councillor Lynn.
Through you,
questions?
Bill, as I said before, I don't envy you in this task because it's a challenge from an equity point of view from a whole range of reasons. People are paying ridiculous prices for residential property as well.
Councillor Dean?
Going back to the rate, cap rebate on the rates, there were quite a few people last year who, from reading the rates, weren't really aware of the fact that they were entitled to one because they were referred to in a fairly vague sentence to a link. When we do the rate this year, if we're going to do that, we must have on there very clearly, if your valuation increase is greater than 10%, you are entitled to a rate rebate. Go to this link. And that wasn't, so it wasn't very clearly spelled out last year. And I know a lot of people were complaining about the rates and were surprised when I said, you realise that you couldn't apply for a rate cap, and told them where to do it. So that's something I think we should bear in mind if we're going to have a rate cap, which I think we should.
I'm sure we can do everything better.
Councillor Bill?
Listening to the phone calls though, very, very few complaints. 2 people have phoned and said, I've just heard that my neighbour got a rebate. Can I have one? Well, that was 3 months ago and there's actually a deadline when you're supposed to apply. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't read things.
Just 2 questions again, Nigel. Firstly, how many people actually took the rebate out? And why can't we automatically put that rebate onto their council rates when they're sent out?
Sorry, I don't have that data, but I'll bring that back to a session that talks about the budget next time. But it partly comes back to the simplicity angle again, that for us to determine all of the development, admittedly we have access to that records would be a fairly time consuming task. So there's that aspect of it. I suspect there was a couple of, shouldn't smile, I suspect there were probably a couple of developments, additions that were happening that might not have had approval. It might have surfaced during the last year. They're not eligible for the rebate as well, but they obviously improved their properties.
Nigel, would you have the numbers last year, the number of rebates that actually were applied for?
No, I'll have to bring that back.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bill.
I think Councillor Bill's made a very good sort of comment in relation to the rebate, and we're making it complicated for people who are offering something, as long as they can find their way through, navigate through the detail to get to it. We don't want to be like that, do we? I thought we'd try and make it as easy as we possibly can for people, and we're trying to ease the burden, not to put another burden on them to ease the burden.
Bill, it's It's actually contrary to the Local Government Act to make it too difficult. You cannot make an application process onerous on people, whatever that means. So we'll endeavour to make it as simple as possible. We will budget for people to apply for the rebate. So as you probably saw in the budget review this year, that we didn't spend all of the rebate money. So once you budgeted for it, you may as well pass that on. So we would sincerely like people to apply.
I don't think I've phrased my question correctly. If we know how many people there are that could apply for this rebate, we would budget for that amount and provide it for those very people, wouldn't we?
Again, there, Bill, it's probably a simplicity thing. Is it worth the administration? A very, very large number of those eligible, very, very large proportion, would have been eligible for a rebate less than $5. Many of them were $1. They wouldn't bother. I suppose we would obviously see probably that, well, they obviously didn't have a significant development going on there or whatever, but that's not necessarily always the case. But I suppose you could automatically apply it. Would it make any difference to those people? Probably not.
Nigel, if I can add to what we did last year. So we did put the message on the rates notice and point taken that it needs to be improved and promoted, maybe bold a little bit more and different wording. We also included the promotion as part of the annual rates summary that's provided with the rates notice, and also a separate flyer in with the rates notice as well. And I know a lot of people just probably put them in the bin and just grab the notice. But I support what Nigel's views as well with regard to applying it automatically. I guess you're saying to everyone whose rates have increased by 10% or greater. It would be quite an administrative task. We have one rates officer at the moment that have to go through and assess all of the 8,500 and pull out. It's not something we can program in the system to sort of separate and print a report of those rates that are greater than 10%. So it would be it's quite time consuming. Also, we'd have to go in, as Nigel said, and assess if anyone had significant development, extensions, etc., to preclude them from receiving the rate rebate. So you'd have to go into another program to see what has happened to that rate, that property over a period of time. So that's why we applied the application process. However, we can maybe advertise multiple times and come up with new initiatives to make sure more people are aware of it.
Once we get to the actual page, it was very simple.
Thank you, Jim.
Sorry, what we will do though is we will find out through our software provider whether the programming changes can be undertaken and at what cost, because ultimately that's the other component, is what cost to actually customize your system to enable it to automatically do what I think we're all in agreement would be quite a logical thing to do. But as Nigel said, this is the simplicity side of things, and sometimes it's an easier option to ask people to apply for the rebate than to try and customise the system that in future years may not be an issue.
Councillor Fad.
Yeah, just for clarification, Nigel, if someone applies for the rebate, are they guaranteed to receive that, or is it discretionally decided upon? And is it a guaranteed 100% of that rebate is passed on, or is it a percentage of?
If eligible, they're guaranteed, and it'll be exactly as council's approved. One other piece of information, Mayor Bill, at least one of the local newspapers picked a fairly large story on the subject last year, so that was reasonably well publicised. We could probably try and get them both to do it this year. That would probably assist.
Well,
Word of mouth is
I
just
think our
like-
council's in a very sound position to be able to discuss this matter, of rates. It is the most important, financial matter we probably talk about all year, and it affects everybody that we, represent. And maybe we can, send a good news story out there, which, most councils will be sending out a bad news story. So, look at it as an opportunity to, really promote what we do as a council, and maybe as a place for future people to want to come and live. So, we can make some really good out of this, even though it's probably overall, we're going to be collecting more money than we did last year anyway.
Just a couple of other things, Mayor Bill, my approach on it was not looking from you for a resolution on this option, because that's not what we're here to do, because you actually have to go through a full budget process before you can, get to the rate declaration. What I intended to do, unless there is violent objection, is to prepare your draft budget on the basis of option 3. So if anybody is violently objected to that and prefer option 1, now's probably the time to say so.
Councillor Simon.
And so I'm very much in favour of option 3, so that's no issue. I was wondering if I could understood you correctly, that the main impact of inflation on our operations is through energy cost and material. Is that sort of correct? That
Might be others that might like to answer that. I think generally, yes.
generally, that's what I sort of thought. So,
Material and construction costs, obviously, as well.
which is in yeah, no, I would have thought, yeah. So the question is, and you said, so do the 3%, if we increase on average our rates by 3%, or the rates, would that cover the extra cost that inflation is gonna put on our operations, or are we gonna have to tighten our belts to a certain degree to actually make that work?
Well, I think, as I said previously, that some of that's target setting. So we're saying you've got 3%, so work within it. Very difficult to do that for some costs. Obviously have to keep the lights on and keep the vehicles working. The thing, as I said earlier, you're part of the inflation story. So if you don't want inflation to go up, don't cause it. It's partly the good budget, but it's probably fair to say, I would imagine, that the greatest pressures will be on, well, you came tonight, on that side of the budget, which doesn't affect your operating. That side of the budget, as the committee spoke about, is in terms of what your asset management approval is. So those numbers are in the plan. It probably means if the costs are high, you get a little bit less bang for your buck. But you're still within the financial parameters. So a very large chunk of your budget are probably within the financial parameters. So we should be able to live with a 3%. But we haven't compiled the entire budget yet, so maybe there's some shock to come.
Just have to cut down on the, paper clips and pads and pens. Councillor Collins?
Yeah, I was going to say, I saw you had some land, an example that gone up 20% at Hamilton. So that's one land sale, I suppose, because not much land ever sells up there. Is the Valuer General, have they changed the way they increase the land, like the value? Because before I was on the understanding you said if there was a small part, because there's very small amounts of land sold in the council area. No, Lynette's was an example, but so he's using very small sample sizes of land sales to put it up 20%. Have they changed that from 10 years ago, and is there a way we can appeal the Valuer General's values as a whole council rather as individual?
I'm not aware that their process has changed for a long period of time. These arguments have been going on ever since I've been around local government. It in terms of the appeal process, that's certainly there. One one sale next door wouldn't normally activate a valuation change. That would have to have reasonable evidence of a general increase in the area. Going by the rain, I think the values next year are going up as well. So that might be the key driver. But what drives those values? It's, income from residential property, income from commercial has a big impact. Maybe people are doing really well. I'm not a valuer.
Thank you, Nigel. Any further questions, councillors? Well, if not, thank you sincerely, Nigel, for that presentation. It's given us a lot to think about. I think I could feel the vibes in the room. I think option 3 is looking like it's the one that we'll probably investigate further and see if we can't do something around that, and hopefully that we can all get some agreements and get out there and hopefully make a good thing from a bad thing. And I think we all have that same intention, that we're here to look after our ratepayers, but we're also here to make sure that we continue with our financial responsibilities to replace the equipment and roads and networks that we have for the future generations as well. So we've got a bit to think about, no doubt, and I'm sure we'll next briefing we have will probably be a little bit less daunting in much of what we've had to take in tonight. It's an exceptional amount of information that you've provided to us and explained very, very clearly. But of course, it can only take in so much. So we've got a little bit to take home with us and some homework to do. And we look forward to our next budget session and see what we can do from there. But I think I like the feeling in the room tonight with the consensus around option 3 and working through that process rather than the more difficult first 2. So thanks everybody, and we move on now. If we want to close that session, move on now to section 4, which is a reports for a decision. We have one from the Rosebery Township expansion, the Higginbotham request. It's an extension of what we agreed to at our last meeting, councillors. I might pass to Craig to perhaps explain the difference, but I understand there's not very much difference to what we agreed at our last council meeting. Thanks, Craig.
Oh, thank you, Mayor Bill, through the chair. Look, I didn't really have anything to add to the report. It's simply looking at having a further bonding agreement, draft was attached, be settled with Higginbotham just to cover that section of Kangaroo Flat Road that connects the new intersection with the entrance to their estate. So it's
Thanks, Craig.
fairly straightforward. Thank you.
I'll probably have something to add to this report. You might recall that Councillor Simon did talk about some trees that are along Kangaroo Flat Road, some trees there that we would like to see retained. Is that correct, Councillor Simon? Well, I had the opportunity to talk with Michael Higginbotham at the Northern York Forum recently, and we had a long chat, and one of the things I raised actually were those trees. And he said, if your council would like those trees retained, they will be. So at this stage, we've got Michael's word for that. So we can bring things up at council that sometimes do get followed up and do get some oxygen. So thanks for bringing it up, and sounds like we've saved 4 trees. Well done. We've got a recommendation about halfway down page 5. Are there any questions in relation to this matter? I think Craig covered it pretty well with his synopsis there. If not, would someone like to move that recommendation? Councillor Dean, would someone like to second that? Councillor Fabio? All those in favour? Those against? That's carried. Thanks, councillors. Meeting can close. I'll still wait for the clock, but mine says 7:58. Thanks, councillors, and we look forward to our next meeting.